It is now 9:01 on Tuesday, September 10th, and we'll go ahead and get started with 10.2, School Finance Formula and New Finance Formula. And we have a special guest for this one as well.
Yes, we do. I'm really excited that for our school finance formula and new finance formula presentation is our budget director, Brian Gustafson. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brian, is your mic on?
There we go.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right, so I'm glad to be here to kick off a 4-part series. We're going to be talking some different finance topics here in September and October with the board. Tonight, as mentioned, going to talk about the school finance formula. And, you know, the cat's out of the bag. There's an old one that we're working on right now and a new one that's coming up soon. So going to touch on both of those. And I know a lot of this will be review for board members and for folks in the room. But I'm hoping you glean a few things out of it. I'm hoping you come away with a little bit of a deeper understanding of the formula, especially some of the variables that impact PSD specifically, and what makes us a floor-funded district, and a reaffirmation, particularly of that relationship of local and state funding. Okay, that'll be the focus of really what I talk about. As we go through this series, we'll focus next time in 2 weeks on property tax and other sources. So I'm not going to get into a whole lot of the local funding angle of things, property taxes and bonds and mills and all that. Hey, that'll be more next time. And then as we get into October, we'll talk about how we spend money, all right, how we allocate funds to the schools and departments and how we spend. And so as board members are thinking ahead, if there are specific sort of angles, topics, items that you'd like to learn more about or hear more about, especially when we're talking about expenditures, please let us know. And as we're preparing those presentations, we can make sure we try and hit some of those things. But today, you're going to talk primarily about revenue and specifically the school finance formula. This really only takes up about 6 lines of our budget, but it's the majority of how our school district is funded. Okay, 74% of our general fund comes from the school finance formula. Right? And it's based primarily on 3 revenue areas: local, state, and federal. Local, as I mentioned, property taxes are the primary driver of local funding. Specific ownership taxes, those are taxes that are paid by residents, people in the district, to licensed motor vehicles. Okay, we receive a portion of that funding. And there are some other local revenues like investment earnings, participation fees for athletics, so on and so forth. Okay. State revenue, that's what I'm going to focus on primarily. Equalization is what I'm going to talk about a lot tonight. The state backfill of the formula, how that's determined, where does that come from, how does that get to us, those kinds of things. There's also state categorical funding. Those are directed streams of revenue for specific, I guess, areas of need, like transportation, special education, vocational education. We're going to save that a little for the next time and focus primarily on that state equalization. Then lastly, we do receive federal revenue in the general fund, but it's less than 1% of what we make in the general fund. Primarily, any federal revenue we see ends up in our grants fund. In the general fund, it's Medicaid dollars, and that's, like I said, a little less than 1% of what we'll generate in the overall general fund. And that's about $2 million or so. So we won't spend much time beyond my comments right there on federal programs tonight. Okay, so this total program, also known as formula funding or the program or the formula, that is really a formulaic determination of how all districts in the state are funded. Okay, and I'm going to get into the dynamics of it, but ultimately it comes to a formula you see on the screen, and let's kind of work backwards on that formula. On the right side, it says equals total program, right? The result of that formula. Hey, each year we're going to get a number established in the legislative process as far as what that number should be. Hey, then the process becomes, well, how can the local dollars satisfy that number of total program calculations? Okay, so let's throw out a number, $300 million. Let's say that's the total program. Okay, then it's up to economics, it's up to us to see, okay, how much can the local property taxes and specific ownership taxes contribute towards that $300 value. Okay. In our case, it's about half this year. Okay. And what property taxes and SO taxes can't satisfy, then the state of Colorado has to backfill or equalize. And it's important to understand there's an inverse relationship between property taxes and that state equalization. The more property taxes that are infused into this equation to satisfy that total program, the fewer equalization dollars get plugged in. Okay? The total program number does not increase with more property taxes. Okay? The fewer property taxes that can come in, that equals more state equalization. Right? So more property taxes do not equal more total program funding dollars. And I'll hit that. I know Superintendent Kingsley mentioned that earlier tonight. Right? He teed it up, okay? But we'll hit that multiple times. Okay, so thinking about that state equalization number, how does the state divide up their budget? And they call it their big six, and there's really 7 items on this pie chart, but the big 6 are K-12 education. These are the categories, primary categories in the state general fund. Healthcare policy and financing, higher education, human services, corrections, and the judicial system. Okay, in the current fiscal year 25 state of Colorado general fund budget, that's a $15.6 billion budget. Okay, 29% is allocated to K-12 education. If you think about early childhood education, that's going to fall into the other pie of 11%. Okay, but K-12 education is the second largest category of the big 6 spending wedges there in the Colorado general fund. On the screen here breaks down those big 6 categories into horizontal bar charts. Okay, and what I really find interesting here is that each one of these, each category, education, healthcare policy, and financing, compares that percentage allocation of the state general fund budget in 2015 versus 2025. Okay, and in 2015, I can attest we were having a lot of the same conversations. Man, we're looking for more funding. We're trying to figure out how can we make this formula work. Okay, a lot of the same stuff. But when I started to look into this and I saw how things have changed, it really caught my attention that education in the last 10 years has gone from being the largest wedge in that pie to the second largest. Okay, an 8% drop. Okay, gone from, it used to make up 37% to down to about 29%. Okay, whereas healthcare policy and financing increased from about 26% back in 2015 to 32% in 2025. And so right there you can surmise that there was a pretty significant shift in the last decade, probably some external factors that changed the way the state has allocated funds, right, and prioritized funding. Right? But I find that fascinating to look at. And then you can see some of the other categories, human services, slight changes, corrections, a decrease there as well, judicial similar. But it's really noticeable how education, the education allocation has changed. Right? So that the formula gets established, the state has to balance conflicting interests in all of those different categories and then determine, okay, how's this formula going to work and how are we going to backfill what the districts need. So let's look into that formula just a little more deeply. And actually this very first slide is a pretty simplified look at it. Okay, this really shows the bare bones of the formula is number of students times dollars per student. Okay, that turns in that total program funding. I gave the example of $300 million. Okay, it's number of kids times per pupil rate to get the $300 million. But there's more that's behind, especially that per pupil rate, but even that enrollment count. There's a lot more to it than those things. And I want to dive into those just a little bit more deeply. It's complex. There are a lot of variables. Okay, now I don't want you to panic at this slide. Okay, it's hard to see. There's a lot going on there. But this is the same formula that was just on the previous slide. It's just extended out and broken down into more categories. And really, all that you really need to focus on is that at the very left-hand side, you see some multiplication symbols. Okay, and what's happening there is there's a base per pupil funding amount, and it's being multiplied by a size factor and a cost of living factor. These are additional factors that add on to a base per pupil rate that will end up turning into a total per pupil rate for funding. Okay, those things are what get multiplied by that funded pupil count. Okay, what's important to note here is that multiplicative nature of this formula is what's got PSD in kind of just sort of a meh spot when it comes to funding. Right? We don't really benefit from a great cost of living factor. It's fairly low compared to what we all know the cost of living to be like here. Hey, we really don't benefit from a tremendous size factor. We're one of the larger districts in the state. We don't benefit from a tremendously high at-risk factor. We're just not quite in a spot where our numbers move the needle there. But what happens is those factors that aren't super beneficial kind of compound as they move through this flow chart that's on your screen. And what that gets us to is what also was mentioned earlier tonight, is a floor funding level. Right? That turns into PSD being at the lowest of the per pupil funding rates. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. What I want to focus on first is how do we count kids? And you would think, gosh, that'd be easy, right? Right? They just show up, you count them, 1, 2, 3, 35, so on and so forth on October 1st, and it's good. And what you find out is if you look through the multiple line finance formula that the state of Colorado produces, student counts are different throughout that entire formula in multiple ways, probably at least a half dozen or more times. And I'm going to point out 4 ways that they differ. The first thing is what's called October membership. Okay, in October membership, if you look in the formula, and it's important to know the nomenclature, October membership is really a head count. Right, that's the number of kids in the district. That's the number of kids in all of our district schools. That's the number of kids in the district charter schools and in the charter school institute schools all together. That's an N. Okay? But in the formula, then that starts to progress to what's called an October FTE count. So in October, when we start to do our counting, and our data analysis team does a really hard and good job of counting, processing, going through data with the state of Colorado, they have to start drilling down into our kids' full-time students, half-time students, are they online students, are they extended high school students, are they part of the Charter School Institute, okay? And a lot of those categories get peeled out. And we get a number called an October FTE count that's a bit smaller than that October membership count. And then that October FTE count gets plugged into a 5-year average. Because in the current school finance formula, it's the current FTE count plus the previous 4 will turn into a 5-year average. Okay? And that's called student FTE averaging. So that gets plugged in. We now have an average number of funded pupils, and that's important because in the current model, districts benefit from either, whichever is greater, your current October FTE count or your averaged FTE count, up to 5 years. And that starts to get confusing for sure. But if you have a really good year and your October is strong, then that's how you're going to get funded. But you've been traditionally in declining enrollment status. But there's a protection for school districts that are in declining enrollment status of this averaging mechanism. Those districts get funded on an average, which basically means that they are funded for students who are no longer in the district. It's a softening mechanism to allow districts to adjust, plan, recover from enrollment declines, as opposed to a harsh year-over-year up and down sort of nature. So what's on the screen now is the 4th count, the district-funded pupil count. That's the determination of which one is greater. Is it your October FTE, or is it your averaged? And then, as this progresses from left to right, you add back in a lot of those factors that were peeled out. So you add back in online students, you add back in extended high school students. Those are kids that go to like Ascent programs and some of our career and innovation programming for beyond high school kids. You add back in a little factor for kindergarten funding. And that all turns into a funded pupil count. So there's a lot really that goes into that part. And so now you get established account, and it's different than certainly your membership number and the other accounts that have popped up. And they can be hard to keep track of sometimes. Okay, so we got to take that number, and we've got to have some dollars to multiply it with to get to our total program or our formula funding. Here in fiscal year 25, the legislative process that occurred last spring established a base per pupil funding rate of $8,496.38 per pupil. Hey, that's the base rate. Every pupil generates that amount of revenue, and that's every 1.0 pupil generates that amount of revenue for a district. Then, I mentioned these factors before, like cost of living, size, at risk, ELL. Those are multipliers. They add additional funds in. And you look at the second bullet there, our PSD funding, including factors of $10,791.65 per pupil, and you think, wow, that's great, right? That's higher than that base. Well, I'll show you how those compare to some other districts here in a second. Okay? That base funding rate, that's what's called the floor. Okay? There aren't any other districts that make lower than that per pupil in Colorado this year. In fact, we built our budget on $10,778.31, which was the base back in the spring, or the floor, the floor. Okay, that's been adjusted slightly, which happens throughout the course of a school year. And so even though our calculation still turns into $10,778 and change, we get an adjusted funding level to get us to that floor. And it's because especially that cost of living factor is just not so helpful. The size factor is not so helpful. And we've been a floor-funded district for a long, long time. I think about a dozen, maybe just fewer than a dozen districts are in this situation. So this is interesting on the screen here. This is comparisons of current fiscal year per pupil rates. PSD at the floor, $10,791.65. Two other floor-funded districts, our neighbors, Thompson and Windsor. And I found it fascinating that in the actual formula sheet, they come in at $10,791.66. 1 cent higher. The rounding errors, right? Yes. But yeah, so three neighboring districts right here, all at that floor level. Okay, just not getting enough out of those factors. If you start to compare with Jeffco, they're just over $11,040 as pupil. St. Vrain, another $53 higher than that. Boulder Valley, you can see, starts to get up into $11,220 and change. If I were to throw Cherry Creek in here, we'd be in the $11,400 range. Greeley, $11,467.30. Then I put in Estes Park, not as a comparable district so much, but that's a district in Larimer County. Okay, $12,730.93 per pupil. Okay, so you're looking at PSD factors add about $2,000 to that base, and you start to get into some bigger numbers, 4,000 plus when you're looking at smaller school districts that benefit from size factors, higher costs of living, whatnot. So that's just an interesting comparison. We're going to talk briefly about a new formula here coming up where it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in a number of years down the road, how the cost of living and size factors will change the impacts on districts. So we multiply that $10,791.65 times our per pupil count, and we get our total program or our formula funding. And that means we're fully funded, right? No. And that's a setup. We've talked about this before. We know that there's one other factor in the current formula that is the factor to adjust all factors. And that was implemented back in the 2008, 2009 range, called the budget stabilization factor. When the state of Colorado was wrestling with their pie at that time, dealing with a Great Recession Hey, how are they going to balance the budget? This was one of the mechanisms that was generated. The bar chart on the screen represents a bar for each fiscal year from 2009 to 2025. And each bar represents 100% funding for that year. What's reflected then is the budget stabilization factors portion of each year's funding. That budget stabilization factor was not funded, it was withheld. Okay, so that's a negative funding. So at its lowest point in 2012-13, just over $32 million was part of our formula here at PSD, but not actually forwarded in our formula to the district because the budget had to be balanced at the state level. Because property taxes, local taxes, couldn't satisfy the entire formula here in PSD. So as we think about property taxes funding the formula, if they can't make up the whole formula, then we are reliant upon the state of Colorado in a spot where we really don't have a whole lot of control to backfill the rest. And if there are other economic circumstances that impact Colorado, this tool, this BS Factor tool, still remains. As of this year, July 1, the budget stabilization factor was eliminated, and so it's $0 right now, but the mechanism still exists. So if next year, 2 years down the road, wherever it is, we run into different economic difficulty, hey, it's still something that could creep its way back into the formula. All told, the impact since 2009 here at PSD, $338,379,607. That is just higher than our compensation obligation this year. And so that's a tremendous impact over a decade and a half. Fortunately, again, that's at $0 right now. So as we look into our current numbers here in the total program, fiscal year 25, the total program calculation generates just under $314 million for us this year. That's 74% of our general fund. And again, I want to point out something it's a little bit interesting. The total program, this is the largest source of our revenue, comes in $17 million shy of our compensation obligation. Right? So we've got to have other sources of revenue. And again, we're going to get into that in 2 weeks. Where does other money come from? But the program does not cover our entire compensation obligation right now. Hi.
Can I ask a quick question? Brian, you're doing phenomenal. I really appreciate how accessible you're making a very complex presentation. For the general public who's listening, either here in person or watching, can you just at a very, very high level allude to what's the funding source of the other 26% of our general fund?
Yeah,
Thank
great. Yeah, thank you. Additional funding sources are the categorical funding that I mentioned earlier. Okay, that's going to be another 17% or so, I believe. And that's dedicated revenue streams, transportation, special education, those kinds of things. Additional funding beyond that, about $65 million this year, are mill levy overrides. Okay, currently there are 6 that we utilize and receive funding for. Hey, that's the second largest chunk of our revenue. Hey, and those, gosh, are the lifeblood, right? If you're thinking about how do you get this above or to meet your obligations and what it takes to run your school system, those are critical in what we do right now. Hey, in the current program, what's pretty interesting to note is that our property tax and specific ownership tax, which are represented in the left 2 wedges of that pie, the gold and the gray wedge, come to about 50% of that program funding. The state has to backfill the other 50%. And when you start to take a step back, kind of like we did with the state overall budget, and you look back to FY15, which is at the top left of the screen, that pie, property tax and SO tax, the local portion, was 40%. And the state was having to backfill 60% of that funding. And when you see numbers like that, you can start to kind of grasp with, okay, here's what the state was wrestling with. They just can't afford to do this at district over district over district. Just 2 years ago at the center illustration there, property tax plus SO tax, that's the local portion, was 43%. The state was equalizing 57% of our program. And then this year we're at 50-50. Well, what's changed? Primarily, what has changed is increase in assessed valuation, right? We've experienced that all in the last year or so. If you're a property owner and know that the property tax obligation has gotten larger, that's going to schools, but it's not increasing the overall funding to schools. It's simply reducing what the state is having to backfill, right? So if you're a budget guy, budget gal, at the state level, this is what you want to see. You want to see those local dollars taking care of local districts. But from our perspective, it's hard to keep communicating, how those increases in property tax don't necessarily mean more money for the schools. Right? That's a hard one to overcome. Another way to look at it is if, and we've done this before, we have this in one of our videos, you think of a couple glasses of water, District A's glass of water, let's use that same $300 million example, right? To fill that glass of water with $300 million of funding, the local share can satisfy $100 million of property tax. Great, that gets poured in first. That's the dark color at the bottom of District A's glass there. That's made up of property and ownership taxes. Then the state share, that equalization, gets poured in on top, another $200 million. Okay? But District B could be vastly different. This could be the Cherry Creek or the Jeffco compared to the Windsor or Thompson, okay? Where the local share generates more property tax. That gets poured in first. That generates 2/3 in this example. So the state only has to backfill 1/3. Right? So the state is constantly wrestling with, all right, what are these backfill amounts looking like? They're trying to project that out based on enrollment counts. There are a lot of variables here. Right? But again, the top of that glass is the top of that glass. Right? There's no extra dollars coming in to roll over unless a district is capable to go above and beyond the formula with tools like mill levy overrides, bonds, other sources of revenue. All right, and it's important to note that the state equalization comes from primarily income tax and sales tax revenues at the state level. There are other taxes collected at the state, like excise taxes and whatnot, but primarily it's income and sales taxes. And we get this question somewhat regularly, well, what about the marijuana money? Because the state taxes marijuana sales. And what's on the screen now is really just a kind of a brief history of when marijuana taxes started to come into place here in Colorado. Okay, starting back with a vote in 2012, that would have been the 13-14 fiscal year. Okay, and different tax rates have been imposed with different votes and different legislation over the last decade or so. Okay, and that has led to some additional funding at schools. Primarily, that comes in the form of capital construction funding in BEST grants. BEST stands for Building Excellent Schools Today. Okay, those are capital funding grants where the first $40 million of marijuana tax revenue goes toward that program. And I don't know off the top of my head how much it cost to build our most recent new schools, but $40 million probably wasn't going to scratch the surface, especially on those two large ones. Okay, now, where this has been really impactful is in rural communities. It's been really impactful in rural communities that are able to go and pursue these grants and just demonstrate the need and maybe not have the funds to match as much as maybe a district like ours would. And they've been able to benefit from these grants. But our most recent BEST grant participation was in 2018, where we received a BEST grant to deal with installing some dust collection systems in middle schools and high schools. That grant was worth, I think, about $130,000. That sound about right? And we had to match $260,000. Right, so to get those projects done, we actually had to provide a much greater match than what we were able to gain. And so, you see the challenge for large districts. If you want to take on larger projects, you still have to come up with your own cash to benefit from some of these grants. Okay, there is some marijuana revenue that flows into state equalization because now some of their taxing structures have it going into a cash fund that gets distributed out, and we really don't see a quantification of what that looks like. It's important to note that just 2 years ago, this revenue as a whole was 0.7% of the state budget. Right, so it's not a tremendous amount. And I think something that may be of concern is that the peak levels of collection were in 2021 at the state level of about $425 million of tax revenue. And just 2 years ago, that was down to $282 million. Right, so that revenue source is changing too. And while it's not extremely influential, it's important to note that that is being altered as well. Okay, and if there aren't enough variables, let's add another school finance formula. So in this last spring, the governor signed into law House Bill 24-1448 that came out of the legislative session, which created a new school finance formula to be implemented in fiscal year 26. So that's next year. So here we are in September, and we're starting to talk about fiscal year 26 funding. And some of the highlights here, this will have a 6-year implementation period concurrent with our existing formula. And so that's going to be interesting for us to figure out how to navigate. And so we're going to be learning. For sure. Okay. Additionally, there will be some similarities. There will be a base per pupil amount. They'll call this the foundation, and that should increase by the rate of inflation annually. There will still be factors with increased weights for at-risk, ELL, special education, and the order is going to be what changes here. Additionally, I wanted to point out this cost of living factor. I've mentioned that a few times and how that's helped really get us to the floor as far as funding. Well, right now, there will be a cost of living factor cap at 23%, a 23% multiplier. Hey, currently, PSD, we're at about 19%. So you think, well, maybe that doesn't impact us too much because we're not at that cap. Well, there are other districts that are above that cap. You take an Aspen, for example, or other districts who are going to be reduced down to 23%. And really, what starts to happen is there's going to be a redistribution of some of those funds throughout the rest of the system. Right? And so other districts that are below start to benefit a little bit in cost of living. There will be a size factor, but only for districts up to 6,500 students, so we won't receive additional funding for size. A new factor, this will replace what is currently in the formula for rural funding, will be called the locale factor. This is based on federal designations. This is not so much a state-determined factor, but federally. And this will provide additional funds for those locations designated as rural or towns. Currently, Fort Collins, PST, we're listed as a mid-sized city locale factor based on this federal designation. So we won't benefit from those funds either. The 5-year averaging, the up to 5-year averaging mechanism will be reduced to a 4-year averaging mechanism for declining enrollments. And it's hard to figure out exactly how that's going to impact us. I'd like to start looking at that, especially once we get into, or we start to receive our October count and our projections for next year that are updated. Then I think we can start to model a little bit and see how, if that might impact us, depending on what our enrollment projections look like. And there will be a phase-in period, as I mentioned, 6 years with a hold harmless provision. Okay, what that means is there will be an understanding by CDE that it has to figure out how to get districts from the current formula to the new formula in sort of a tiered approach. And so on the screen is a chart that basically shows two parallel lines, each going from the current fiscal year through 6 years. The bottom one being current law, the top being new formula, and a strategy on how to move a district from the current to the new. An example would be if a district wouldn't already be benefiting from that new formula, okay, then the district would use their current program plus 18% of the differential between the two. And they have this sort of tiered approach built. Now, I would expect that we're going to see some changes and adjustments as this goes, but we'll have to start to see what does this look like for us. We really don't know beyond a 1-year projection right now. As I mentioned, there will still be some of the same factors: at-risk, ELL, special education, cost of living, size. I talked about locale and online and extended high school. The difference with how this formula will work is they don't have the compounding impact of multiplication at the very beginning. It'll basically be each factor times the foundation or the base. Then you add that to the next factor, which was multiplied times the foundation of the base. Okay? And so it's a little more evenly distributed, a little more summative as opposed to the compounding, multiplicative nature of the current. Will that benefit us? Hard to tell. Hard to tell right now. There are estimators out there. The CDE has produced some runs, estimates on what this would look like for all districts in 25-26. Of course, there are a lot of variables. Who knows what the enrollment really looks like? Okay? Who knows what the cost of living really looks like at those times? But year over year, trying to keep variables similar, CDE estimates maybe up to $1 million of new revenue. There's another estimator that actually is really cool. You can go online, the School Finance Formula Simulator tool. And there's a link here at the back of the presentation. And you can start to mess with some of the different, factors and see how they impact districts. Okay. But that shows maybe up to a $1.8 million addition of funding. Honestly, right now, though, there's just so many variables, we just don't know. Could be zero. I would hope it's not negative. It's not supposed to be negative. They're supposed to be hold harmless. But we're not sure. And so we're going to go through this phase-in period of having two formulas for a while, starting next year. And we'll start, of course, planning for that here middle of this year as we start building our budget. And again, some resources, and there are a couple others if board members, if you ever have the need to want to go look for stuff, there's pretty interesting stuff out there. There's a legislative summary of the school finance formula that's about 85 pages, but it's actually pretty good as far as good pictures and it's pretty sequential and it's certainly helpful. Currently, there are still ongoing adequacy studies dealing with the funding formulas. So this new formula was implemented prior to the completion of these adequacy studies that are looking at-risk factors, at what it would take to provide equity in the formula and adequately fund public schools in Colorado. So we're expecting to see some results or recommendations from those studies in January, and my guess is that we would start to see those impact changes in the new formula moving forward. All right, with that, it's hopefully a pretty high level look at current formula, new formula, what's in between, and would love to take some questions and see what else we can answer.
Brian, thank you so much for that. It's amazing to me how you come in and you think, okay, well, it's got to be easy, right? It's pure multiplication. It's number of people times money, and that's what you get. And it's really more like differential equations. You got a multivariable calculus or something's happening here that is much more difficult for those of us who are simply trying to pay our taxes and get better schools to understand. So thank you so much for breaking it down for us and really helping us understand that. I love the analogy of it's a glass and we can fill the glass, but we can't do any more than that. And it doesn't matter how much water is ours or how much water is the state's, the glass is the glass, and that's it.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so thank you so much for that. Any questions that the board may have? I actually do have one, then if nobody, how does this work with the special session law that was just signed? I know that there were some questions going in, and do we have any better answers now that it's been a whole week since we've been able to study the new law?
I don't know that there are many more answers, and we'll cue that up for next time. So we'll talk a little bit more next time about that. That's more on the properties tax side of things and how that might be impactful, but we just don't know a lot yet.
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? Yeah, Connor.
Brian, on the per pupil funding slide where you have all the different comparative districts, do you have any insight on what's pushing Greeley School District up? We have almost $1,500 or at least $1,000 over us.
Well, I would think, without having it right in front of me, I would think the at-risk factor is much higher there. And that might be the largest driver, honestly, as I'm just thinking about it. Other thoughts, Dave?
No, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, that is accurate, and they, with the new finance formula, will benefit even greater as a result of that change. So stay tuned for that.
And the other one, so they moved from 5-year rolling average on the decline to 4. Is that was the big thing?
Correct.
We've had decline in enrollment. The 5-year average is beneficial to us. The 4-year average is a little less beneficial to us. Any material impact from that change?
Hard to know right now. As I was mentioning, I really would like to get this fiscal year October count and pair it with some updated enrollment projections that will be coming out middle of this year to start plugging into both formulas to see before I can really weigh in on what would that impact look like. As you mentioned, I agree in that it certainly benefits the state equalization side of the formula. Right? It's less, it would provide less that the state would have to equalize if you're not giving as much of a cushion to declining enrollment districts. So we'll do some projecting and see what that looks like as we prepare our budget.
Other questions? Jim, did you have a question? Okay. I think, the one other thing that I'd really like to point out is when you start looking at state comparisons, Colorado is not at the top. It's not in the top 50%. We are in the bottom 25%, depending on how you look, and where it can be as far as I can tell, anywhere from about number 35 to number about 48, depending on how you count the funding. And so when we're talking about additional funds for schools, we are nowhere near the top of the list of $24,000 per pupil, or even midway at $16,000 per pupil. We're not close to that. And so I just want to put that out there as well, that we are a very highly educated community. We all value education highly, and yet as a state, we don't pay for it. And I just want to throw that out there as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Brian, I want to thank you. Our core business as a school system is learning and teaching, and I want to say that you are one incredible teacher, and your presentation tonight helped a lot of us learn in meaningful ways. This district's really lucky to have you, so thank you for your leadership.
Thanks for your nice comments.
Thank you so much.